So for today, we are going to be filling in some guided notes. And so you're going to have to go to the Schoology page and access those notes and maybe have a split screen or print those and work your way through those as you watch this video. So we're starting Greek and Roman mythology, and we'll look at some smaller, shorter pieces and talk about mythology in general. And then we'll eventually make our way into the Odyssey, which is our long story that we'll read within this unit. And so before we even get there, we need to talk about what mythology even is and why we study it. So if you look at this first slide, why do we study mythology? All of those images are taken from Greek mythology. So when you think about the Nike shoe up in the corner there, Nike was a Greek god. Trident, that's the symbol that Poseidon carries with him, or the weapon, I guess I should say, that has become known as Poseidon's symbol. Ajax, Greek god. Achilles, Greek hero. Cupid, Greek god. The Odyssey is the story that we're going to be reading. It represents a long journey. So it seems appropriate that a minivan would be called the Odyssey, because typically you think minivans, families, vacations, going on long journeys. So all of these things that you see pictures of here stem from Greek and or Roman mythology. So what is a myth? Myth, the word itself, comes from the Greek word mythos, which means a spoken story. So as you can probably gather from that, Greek myths were originally handed down by word of mouth or songs. They were sung or told at gatherings, or just at random storytellings. There were famous storytellers who would go from town to town, much like popular speakers or singers would have concerts today. People back then, their storytellers were famous. So they would go from town to town and tell their stories. And all the people within these villages would come to hear them tell their stories because they were so good at it. By the 8th century, these stories then, at that point, began to be written down. And it's at that point, or around then, that Homer, who's known as the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, that's when he started telling his stories. And he is credited with writing these stories down, not with creating them, but with actually writing them down. So the Iliad is the story of the Trojan War with a horse that the Greeks gave to the Trojans and ended up burning their cause. They were able to burn the city of Troy down because of their wooden horse trick. And then the kind of sequel to that is the Odyssey, which is the story that we will read, which is one of the heroes, actually the guy that came up with the idea for the Trojan horse trick, Odysseus, one of the great Greek warriors. It's his story about how it takes him 10 years to make it home from the Trojan War. And so we'll read about all the adventures that he had to go on during his Odyssey, his journey back home. Now, these myths, just like most stories that are passed down by word of mouth, think about the telephone game that you may have played when you were kids, where you whisper into one kid's ear, the message starts as one thing, and by the time it gets down the line, it's changed to be something completely different. The same thing happens with these stories when they're told over and over again. People forget things, they add things, they embellish. So these myths have changed over time to reflect local customs, social and political conditions, as well as, of course, contemporary issues. Now, there are 3 types of myths. The first are referred to as divine myths. And divine myths tell of a natural phenomena. They're used to explain beyond the bounds of knowledge. So, of course, divine myths are going to include the creation myths, which have divine beings in them, stories concerning the gods and goddesses, accounts of time before humankind even existed. In divine myths, gods are often depicted as forces of nature. The next type of myth is a hero myth, which is what we'll read. We will read, when we read the story of Odysseus in the Odyssey, it is a hero myth. So they are mythological memories of human past. So we'll read about the picture, the image here on this screen. is Achilles, and he certainly is known as one of the greatest Greek warriors to have ever lived. So he would, or his story would be told in a heroic myth. The main characters of heroic myths are mortals. They're not divine, but some are related to the gods. So when a character has one parent who is a mortal, meaning a typical human who lives and dies, and one parent who is a god or a goddess, they have a certain name for them. Do any of you know what that name is called? Think about it, look it up. What is a character called who has one parent who is mortal and one who is divine? We'll come back to it. Tell of the great leaders whose deeds are Geez, I messed that up, didn't I? Tell of great leaders whose deeds are legendary. So heroic myths often depict great leaders. And so I think that when you look at and you read stories like this, heroic myths, a lot of the things that, especially in Greek mythology, the Greeks seem to value in their leaders are things that we still value today, right? We love that positive leadership. We love the camaraderie that exists when a leader is good and the people want to be with that leader. A leader who's going to support those people who are his followers, not lead them into a fool's paradise, if you will. Finally, heroic myths reflect extreme examples of human behavior with both positive and negative effects. So I think anytime that you read mythology, you really have to remember that you have to keep an open mind. Many of the things you read are not possible, right? These are not to be viewed as informational text. These are pieces of literature, pieces of fiction. And so you almost have to kind of suspend that disbelief. Can someone be born from someone else's head or a hip? No, absolutely not. But in mythology, it happens. And so you just have to go along with it and open up your imagination and appreciate the writing itself. Finally, the third type of myth can be referred to as folk stories. And in folk stories, typically something is explained. Human conditions might be explained, societal fears, important rites of passage, moral guidance. These are stories of great trials or quests. And just to go back a little bit, so a lot of times folk stories explain something that, like, why something is the way it is, why there are earthquakes or why there are this or that, where they stem from, right? So those are folk stories. Now, what is the relation with religion to mythology? Is mythology viewed as a kind of a religious source of literature? I think to understand this, you have to understand that the Greeks view the gods as elemental forces. So like Zeus is known as the sky god. Hera, his wife, represents the earth. As the Greek society developed, the gods take on the attributes then of humans. So Athena, she represents wisdom, hence the reason her symbol is always that owl that she carries around. And when we think owls, we do think intelligence, for they are often depicted as wise beings. Mortals, or humans like ourselves, feared the gods out of a fear of divine retribution. So a lot of times humans, mortals, they were afraid to upset the gods because of the revenge they knew the gods may get on them. And so they did not want to displease the gods because they were scared of what would happen to them if they did. The Greek gods were worshipped. Mortals built temples to the gods. They built all kinds of statues to honor the gods. They sacrificed animals to the gods. So they certainly worshipped the gods as divine beings. And like I said, they made sacrifices to the gods at the temples. And that could be gold, things like that. But more than likely, it was typically the sacrificing of animals, like a black ewe or lamb, a bull. And they would burn them and let the blood, well, they just unfortunately were not kind to animals when they made their sacrifices. All right, so let's move to how according to Greek mythology, the world first began. So this is going to be before any people were alive, okay? Before they were even in any kind of existence. So before there was anything, there was just chaos. There was a nothingness, okay? Imagine just out in the atmosphere, just nothing. From nothing came Erebus and night. And Erebus actually means darkness and then night. So those were kind of the first two things that existed. And from them, we get this kind of, it's described as different things. And I also need to point out that you're going to see different versions of this story. Remember, it is Greek mythology and it was initially passed down orally. So the story differs depending on which source you go to. Okay. So you may find something different if you would research this than what I'm telling you now. I think especially in these first few levels of the creation story here, once you get down into where the monsters, the titans, all that, I think then it becomes pretty regular. But these first few levels, you will find some contradicting information on. So then we get this kind of gigantic egg type of thing referred to as love. And from love, we get light and day. So if you think about it, we now have darkness and night, and now we have light and day, right? So we've established the sun and daytime, and then of course we've established the nighttime. From there, we get our first set of parents, Gaia and Uranus. So Gaia is known as Mother Earth, and Uranus is known as Father Heavens. And these two procreate and end up having monsters, Cyclops, and then a group of Titans, which we're going to describe a little bit in more detail. So once again, Uranus is referred to as the father, okay? He's that male figure, if you will, and he represents heaven, whereas Gaia represents the earth. And they gave birth to three enormous monsters. They gave birth to three Cyclopses, which are beings with one eye, typically in the center of their forehead. And then they gave birth to 12 Titans, and you can read through their names. I think the one that probably may stand out to you would be the last one on that list, Cronus. And from his name, we get the word chronology. Or chronological order, right? Doing things in the order in which they happened. So the other ones are Tethys, Oceanus, Thea, Hyperion, Mnemosyne, Crius, Phoebe, Coeus, Themis, Apatus, Rhea, and then Cronus. So those were the 12 Titans. And when you think about the Titans, your mind probably goes to maybe the Tennessee Titans, right? A lot of teams are named as their mascot, they have the Titans. If you think, if you've ever seen the movie Remember the Titans, that was a high school football team, right? And what do the Titans represent? Right? Why would you want to name your team or have your school mascot be the Titans? Well, they're known for their strength, okay? So that just their physical strength. And so that's why it's appealing to schools to use that as a mascot. So let me go back here for a second. Rhea and Cronus, which you'll see those two bottoms, brother and sister, they end up, I'll say marrying. I don't know what marrying would have been like back then, but they end up as a couple. Okay. And I know they're brother and sister, but there's no one else to choose from that's alive, right? This is it. When we talk people per se, it's only these individuals. And so they get together and they have children, okay? Or actually, I should say before they have children. Cronus ends up overthrowing his father. Who's his father? Uranus, remember? So he overthrows his father by castrating him. If you don't know what that means, look it up. From Uranus's blood, once that castration took place, a race of giants was born and three female creatures called the Furies. You've probably seen the Furies represented in, if you've ever watched any Disney movies that are related to Greek mythology, like Hercules, you've seen the Furies. So Uranus curses his son Cronus and says, "You will be slain by a child of your own." So it's almost like a prophecy that he gives his son. So after Cronus overthrows his father Uranus, he becomes king, right? He becomes the ruler of the universe. But in the back of his mind, he always has that threat that his father issued to him: you will be slain by a child of your own. So if that's the prophecy, and if, of course, you believe in prophecies, and that's what was told would happen to you, would you have kids? I mean, what are you going to do? So Cronus and Rhea, although fearing the prophecy that, one of their children will overthrow him, Rhea still ends up getting pregnant and gives birth to, these names should sound familiar, they eventually become part of the Olympians, the 12 Olympians. So Rhea gives birth to Poseidon, Hades, Zeus, Hera, Hestia, and Demeter. So Cronus, out of fearing that one of these kids will overthrow him, right? This in some horrible way, just like he overthrew his father, he decides to eat them all. Remember, you have to just go with the flow here and use your imagination. So he eats them all. But Rhea, she loves her children, right? She's a super involved mom, and she wants all of her children to grow up happy and healthy, but she doesn't get to the first five. But she is able to save the last one, Zeus. She wrapped a stone in a blanket and handed it to her husband Cronus and said, here's our last son. And he ate it thinking it was Zeus. But the woman, his wife, Rhea, tricked him. And so one of Cronus and Rhea's children remains at large out there to grow, to mature, to become a man, right? Now, Zeus returns eventually, right? He's the child that survived. He returns eventually to fulfill Uranus's prophecy. Remember, that prophecy is spoken to his son Cronus after he had castrated him, saying, one of your children will overthrow you, right? Okay. So Rhea eventually introduces the full-grown Zeus to Cronus as a cupbearer. So Cronus, he doesn't have any inclination that any of his children are still alive. So he meets this young lad, and lo and behold, Zeus poisons Cronus, right, with a drink that he brought him as a cupbearer, and causes Cronus to vomit up all of his children. Now, the children, although it's been years and years, they are fully grown, they are alive, and they are strong. So now, Poseidon, Hades, Zeus, Hera, Hestia, and Demeter are all living adults. Cronus calls to all of his siblings, the other Titans, to come to his side, and he wages war against the next generation, his own children, the Olympians. So now we have a war between the Titans and the Olympians. So Atlas, the strongest Titan, and if you recall, Atlas is the one that can hold the world above his head. He leads the fight against the younger, less experienced gods, the Olympians. The war lasts for 10 years. Zeus and his siblings, of course, fight against them. Prometheus, who's a Titan, he's known for his forethought, and Epimetheus, afterthought, end up joining the Olympians. They're Atlas's brothers. They decide they don't want to fight for the Titans. They'd rather fight for the Olympians. So definitely the lines being drawn, and everyone who is able to fight, who is a being that's able to fight, is having to choose a side. Zeus ends up freeing the monsters and the Cyclops, those other kids that, if you recall, Uranus and Gaia initially had. He frees them so that they can join the Olympian side as well. So as I said, the war lasted 10 years. The Olympians end up winning. And so that means now that one of their generation is going to become king, the ruler of all, right? Because they've defeated Cronus now, who was the ruler. So Zeus ends up becoming the supreme ruler of the universe, and he fiercely punishes the Titans. Zeus makes Atlas stand for the rest of his life, holding up the universe. So Zeus and his brothers draw lots for control of the universe. Zeus sits over them all, right? He is the supreme ruler, lord of the sky, rain god, cloud gatherer. His power is greater than everyone else's put together. And I guess it makes sense because he's the one who initiated this whole war to begin with, right? He was the leader from the beginning because he's the only one that survived, thanks to his mom, Rhea, saving him. Poseidon became god of the sea, amongst other things, but god of the sea is what he's most known for. Hades became god of the underworld. And then you can kind of look back. We're going to do a little research project on what the others became in charge of, if you will. So those are the notes for today. You may have to go back and watch this a couple times, or at least look through the slides so that you can fulfill or fill in all the blanks in your note sheet. There will be a quiz over these notes. So it is important that you complete the worksheet and have it in your Schoology notes that way, or in your account, I guess, so that when we do have a quiz, you have your notes to study from. All right. If you have any questions, let me know. I will see you guys with another video tomorrow.